today, Pauline, Ben, and Sveta will be discussing brain physics. So over to you, Pauline.
Okay, thank you. Let me first get this working. All right, thanks, Archer, for organizing this very nice initiative, and it's very exciting to see so many interesting talks about research projects going on in the school. So today, we are going to talk about the physics of the brain and the brain-inspired artificial intelligence. My name is Pulin Gong. So some of you may know me, but anyway. So first, I want to give an overview about our group, complex systems group, and I will talk about as physicists why we care about the brain, why we need to study the brain. So for complex systems group, we have 4 continuous staff, including Professor Peter Robinson and Svetlana Postnova, and also Prof Fulcher and myself. So our center, our group is associated with a few centers, including like ARC, Center of Excellence for Integrative Brain Function, and also like a Center of Complex Systems at UC. So basically, we work on revealing physical principles of the brain dynamics, function, and also brain-body interactions, such as brain and sleep. So as you will see from our projects, and we care about like dynamics and also function and brain-body interactions. So we use and also extend some methods or theories from statistical physics and also nonlinear dynamics and also machine learning to develop new models and also new theories and also new methods to understand how the brain works. Anyway, so why we care about the brain, right? Because we know that the brain is the most complex system in the universe. Of course, there could be aliens, right? Aliens could be smarter than us, but who knows? But so far, in the known universe, the brain is the most complex system. So as you can see from this figure, so from molecular level to the whole brain, so the brain has around like 11 orders of magnitude of spatial structure. So this is huge and also a remarkable fact, right? It is around like 11 orders. So the problem is how the brain can integrate these different spatial and temporal orders to do computation. That's a very important question. And also each neuron, when you look at this level, at the neural level and the circuit level, you see each neuron, as shown here, each neuron receives like thousands of synaptic input. So together, forming a complex network, and then everything like emerge from this complex network. It will allow us to do computation like perception and decision making, attention, whatsoever. Actually, for each cubic millimeter of cortex, which is around the size of a rice grain, it contains billions of synapses. So what are synapses? Synapses are connections between different neurons. You see, that's really a lot of materials going on there in the brain. So to understand how the brain works, there have been recent worldwide initiatives, including the America Brain Initiative and the Human Connectome Project in Europe, and also Japan Brain Project, and also China Brain Project as well. So these big projects have been collecting a lot of data, right? And so we need physicists to develop new methods and also new theories and models to interpret those data, and also to come up with some sort of unified theories for explaining how the brain works. So this situation for understanding the complex system like the brain, how the brain works, is analogous to, Newton to classical physics. In these days, we need new Newton for understanding how the brain works. So, along this sort of line, actually, I think that a lot of opportunities for developing new physics and also new mathematics and also new technologies whatsoever. So it's quite exciting. So, and also, as we know that, artificial intelligence is leading to the fourth industry revolution. But the current artificial intelligence based on deep neural networks, something I'm going to talk about shortly by talking about my research project. It's nowhere close to what we can do now. For example, currently I'm talking, meanwhile I can wave my hands, right? I can do this sort of parallel computation. But the current AI can't do anything like that. So the point is that we get to look into the brain for inspiration, so we may come up brain-inspired artificial intelligence for industry. So this brain-inspired artificial intelligence is main focus of some famous like industry like DeepMind and also like Neuralink. And also, studying how the brain works has important medical implications. Because if you know the principles about how the brain works, we may come up with new biomarkers for brain disorders, such as epilepsy. So this is something we are going to talk about by talking about our products later on. So that's about brief overview. And then I'm talking about my research projects. So basically, I'm interested in the following few these sort of big questions, such as how brain functions like perception, memory, attention, decision-making, how they can all emerge from collective interactions of neurons embedded in complex neural circuits. And also, I'm interested in, can we come up with some sort of general principles, physical principles, to provide a sort of like unified account for neural dynamics and the computation? And then, can we use these principles to develop or create new brain-inspired artificial intelligence? So I'll go through my projects. You will see the efforts we've been making to address those questions. So particularly, my research has been focusing on this sort of circuit level, like neural circuit level. So here, this is schematic of neural circuits. We have a lot of neurons, excitatory neurons, inhibitory neurons, okay, they're connected to each other. So very interesting property of neural activity is that actually neurons, they fire in a very, very variable, irregular way. So here you see this is one spike, another spike, another spike. So this is what experimental trial. This is another experimental trial. As you can see, so these spikes are very, very noisy and very, very variable. So that's very interesting, because when you think about other computing machines, such as computer or whatsoever, computations done in computer are based on some very precise this sort of electrical activity. But in the brain, as you can see here, electrical activity of neuron is very variable. However, at a circuit level, we can see this sort of emergent, these sort of patterns, okay, spatial temporal patterns like the sync pattern, spiral wave, and the Sandel wave patterns. So this, therefore, makes me to think about turbulence and to use turbulence as a sort of analogy to inspire some sort of new physics-based methods to detect and analyze these sort of spatial temporal patterns in the brain. Because as we know in the turbulence, so we have this sort of variable behavior of individual molecules. However, at the system level, we have this sort of like emergent coherent structures called like vortices. You see one vortex, another vortex. So this is very analogous to this complex dynamics in the brain. Just inspired by this sort of turbulence physics, we developed some sort of like methods for detecting this sort of spatial temporal patterns in the brain. So this is based on a project, collaborative project with Professor Thomas Knopfield from Imperial College London. So this is data from the whole brain of mice. As you can see, we have this sort of like dynamical wave patterns, they're moving, interacting, doing a lot of interesting things there. And also we have our own product based on this joint flagship scheme funded by UC and Fudan University. So we focus on this whole brain dynamics of the the human brain, right? And we found these sort of localized moving patterns based on our turbulence-inspired methods. I mean, you have many these sort of moving patterns. I mean, they interact with each other, doing something fantastic. So we try to first detect those patterns, and then we try to figure out how they together do some sort of distributed dynamical computation. And also, we want to get principled spatial temporal dynamics of those patterns, and then we wanted to develop new biomarkers for brain disease. So this is ongoing project with Fudan University. And also, as I said, I mean, I'm interested in this, I mean, a sort of like unified theory, which can explain a lot of like brain functions. So this is a recent work we've done. I mean, we developed a normative theory, which we call fractional neural sampling theory. So this theory actually was motivated by our experimental observation based on our collaboration with the experimentalists. So we found that in the MT area, which is part of the cortex of monkeys, yeah, we can see this sort of localized activity pattern. So this pattern is not static, it moves, okay? It stays here for a while and then jump to another location. So this motion is not like regular, this sort of smooth propagating wave as you started in your first year physics or second year physics. So this sort of propagation has very rich spatial temporal dynamics. As I said, it will stay here for a while and then jump to another location and so on. So this sort of movement in math is called fractional super diffusive motion. Okay, it means that it propagates a little bit faster than normal diffusion, and also its trajectory is fractional. It's fractional. So just motivated by this experimental observation, we formulated this this simple but powerful, effective theory, right? Which we call FINS, okay, fractional neural sampling. So we have, so this is just the random walker of high-dimensional system, but the motion of this random walker follows this sort of like fractional super diffusion, as I just mentioned. And then we can solve this equation based on based on this fractional Fock plot equation. We can figure out, mathematically we can figure out how this random walker responds to external input. So the response from this random walker to external input actually can be formulated by the fractional Fock plot equation, and then we can formulate the whole thing as a sort of sampling-based probabilistic representation and computation. So the idea is that, so neural circuits have this sort of complex motion. This motion does this sort of like a probabilistic inference, okay, based on this sort of random sampling. So the computational advantage of this sort of probabilistic sampling is that if I give you two probabilistic distributions, one here, another there, right? This is multi-mode distributions. You see the modes, these two modes are far from each other. If you use conventional sampling methods like MCMC, so your walker, random walker, would be trapped to this mode, can't capture another mode, but our theory can do this. So from this figure, you can see that if the distance between two modes increases, and the sampling time for our theory only linear increase. However, for classical theory like MCMC and many other methods based on MCMC, you see, I mean, the time increases exponentially. So based on this is a simple theory, a mathematical theory based on this fractional Fock plot equation, and then we set up some sort of new neural circuits, and based on these circuits, we can implement our theory, and then based on these real neural circuits, we can explain attention, okay, because for attention, you see when I ask you to pay attention to these two spots, I mean, sometimes you look at this spot, sometimes you look at another spot. So your attention switches back and forth around 4 Hertz. So there are a lot of recent experimental work on this topic. But our theory can explain that. I mean, why you have 4 Hertz, which is called theta oscillation happening there. And also why you have this sort of some other high frequency oscillations happening there. And also we predict that, I mean, for attention, for example, if I ask you to pay attention to these two spots, of course, your attention can switch back and forth between the two spots, but occasionally it jumps to another location as well. So this just like exploration and exploitation, because our theory can explain that attention can address this long-standing puzzling factor, which is, I mean, how you can balance exploration and also exploitation. And also based on this theory and this realistic circuit implementation, we can explain working memory. So working memory is, I mean, if I ask you to hold something for some transient period of time, and then you see your activity will switch back and forth between different items, okay? So working memory is maintained in a very dynamical and flexible way. And more importantly, our theory and our circuit model can explain so why there's a working memory limit, because we know that the working memory has a capacity limit, which is around 4 items. You see, we are not smart as we think, because our working memory is very limited. So we can explain so why we have this sort of working memory capacity limit. And also we have another project. So based on this theory, we can explain memory retrieval. So this is an animal study. So I mean, I think this is for rats, okay? After rats explore 2D space, and then they did this sort of like a retrieval study, I mean, memory retrieval study. They found that one place is retrieved, another place is retrieved. You see, it's not continuous attractor, or it's not continuous trajectory. So space is retrieved at a discrete spots, which can be explained by this fractional motion and also our circuit, this sort of implementation. And also we've been developing some new mean field theory by extending classical this mean field to non-equilibrium and a nonlinear regime, particularly to explain, I mean, heterogeneous neural circuits, because in real neural circuits, just like real society, I mean, individual neurons, they receive different numbers of inputs. Some neurons, they receive a lot of inputs. Some neurons, they receive less inputs. So it's sort of like heterogeneous neural circuits. And so our theory can explain how complex dynamics, I mean, this sort of like burst oscillations can arise from this sort of like heterogeneous neural circuits. Again, in our theory, we use, and also by extending the fractional Fock-Clarke equations as well. So I think this is a very interesting direction. And along this line of research, we have few projects to offer. My project is to extend this theory to spatial domain, okay? As soon as it's extended to spatial domain, you'll get this sort of localized modes emerging out. But this mode is not a linear mode. It's sort of nonlinear mode, okay? So there are a lot of interesting theoretical questions here along this line of research. And finally, I want to mention another ongoing project in my group. As I said, I'm also interested in brain-inspired artificial intelligence, because in these days, we know that, I mean, deep neural networks, so this is basic structure of deep neural networks. It has many, many layers with these feed-forward connections. So by training these sort of feed-forward neural networks, I mean, which is called deep neural networks, so it can do a lot of amazing work, such as pattern recognition, self-driving, okay, whatsoever. So very, very powerful. So this sort of like network and also some other related networks actually are driving this fourth industry revolution, as I've said. However, so far, so people that treat these deep neural networks as a black box. So nobody knows how these deep networks work. So there is a very recent review paper on this point. It says that a reasonable effectiveness of deep learning in artificial intelligence. So it works very effectively, but nobody knows. So why, I mean, these networks have this sort of like amazing effectiveness. So we recently got some insight about this, this question. Particularly, we look at the geometrical structure of a loss function of deep neural network, because by doing this optimization, the point is that you try to optimize your loss function. So we found that this loss function, of course, is high dimensional, because this is, I mean, the network has like, I mean, millions parameters. So this loss function is high dimensional. So we found that very interestingly, so this loss function structure is fractal. It's fractal, it means that it has this sort of self-similar structure as shown here. So if this fractal geometrical structure, and then you have this learning algorithm, which is a stochastic gradient descent, right? Gradient descent is just first order derivative of this loss function. So if you have that stochastic gradient descent walking down along this fractal landscape, you see, because it's fractal, it has to be sort of like great fluctuations. So these fluctuations will generate fluctuations of gradient values. It means that, so sometimes you have smaller step size of your stochastic gradient descent, this learning algorithm, right? I mean, the Fulcher. Sometimes you have smaller steps, sometimes you have big steps, because this self-similar, this fractal structure. That just because of these big steps, you have these occasional big steps. So these big jumps will prevent the Fulcher, which is learner, to be trapped in bad local minimum. So your Fulcher will keep jumping until it reaches this global minimum. So that's the way how it works. That's the way why deep neural networks can find this very global optimal point, which is also flat. Okay, that's just because this interaction given this geometrical structure and the gradient descent. And again, here we can formulate this process as a sort of like a fractional diffusion process, just like something we've done for neural computation theory. Okay, so this is just the application of our theory. So actually, along this line of research, we have a few exciting research projects. I mean, we want to figure out the mechanism of this complex fractal loss function, and also we want to develop new learning methods. Okay, just by attending this fractional neural sampling theory to develop new methods. We are making some progress along this direction, and also we want to develop new brain-inspired deep neural networks by incorporating the attention mechanism we've identified. Okay, so the attention mechanism I've just mentioned. Okay, stay here for a while, and then you scan another location in a scale-free manner. All right, that's all from me. And finally, and most importantly, I would like to thank my collaborators, Professor Paul Martin from UC, and also Sam Solomon from University College London, and also Chao Song Zhu from Hong Kong University, Jeffrey Feng from Fudan University, Thomas Knopfield from Imperial College London. And I've been working with a bunch of PhD students, like Yuxi, Qi, Rory, Adam, Guozhang, Braden, Asim, Yifan, and Xian. And also the project has been funded by ARC DP projects. Thank you, guys. Thanks.
Thanks, Pulin. Should I go next?
Yeah, you should go next.
All right. Here I am. All right, so thanks, Pulin, and thanks, Archel, for organizing, and thanks, everyone, for joining. I'm going to talk a bit about the stuff that we like to think about in my little subset of the complex systems group. So one thing being called the complex systems group is we like to think about complex systems, which is, well, you can think about what a complex system, what it means to be a complex system. Normally it means something with many interacting components that produces interesting patterns that we can study. And so typically to understand and quantify those patterns, we use methods from statistical physics, some information theory, and often with recent data from complex systems, we have very large data sets. So we need to use methods from modern statistical areas like machine learning to extract and understand the patterns. And being physicists, we like to try and find mechanisms. So we then try and formulate models that might reproduce some of the patterns that we see in the data that we measured from the world. So some of the research that I'm interested in looking at has to do with this general field of complex systems, finding interesting patterns and trying to explain them using new physical theories from really diverse systems across the disciplines. So one example of work that I do in this space is looking at time series. So a time series is something that you measure from a system again and again over time. So you can see there at the left in panel A, some examples of time series from different systems across science. You can see the share prices as a kind of slow fluctuation over time, measures from the heart as kind of these bursty periodic sorts of systems. EEGs have characteristic oscillations. So one of the questions we asked is, what is the structure of all these different types of data measured from different parts of science, from really different systems with different mechanisms? Because what tends to happen in each discipline is they have their own methods for analyzing their data. So if you measure one of these heartbeat intervals, people in biology will have their own methods for analyzing heartbeats. And then you go into the next scientific building on campus and they'll be measuring audio and they'll have their own methods for analyzing audio. And then you go to the next building and so on. So everyone's measuring these objects without really comparing the methods that they use to analyze them and without looking for similarities in the structure of their data either. So one ongoing project we have is actually collecting all the data from all these different disciplines, collecting all the methods that they use in all these different disciplines and putting them all together in one coherent framework. And so the matrix that I've plotted there in panel C is the result of applying almost 9,000 different scientific methods to almost 900 different scientific time series. And you can see there's a lot of structure in that matrix. Sometimes you have groups of methods from very different disciplines that actually give similar outputs across real data. You can see them as kind of clusters of columns that have similar patterns of red and blue being the outputs of those algorithms. So this is work that we've done in kind of collecting and organizing methods for doing science and trying to project all of the beautiful work done in different disciplines into one coherent package that allows us to take all the best minds from maths, all the best minds from statistics, from astrophysics, from biology, and put all their methods together and use them as one kind of powerful joint resource, rather than just picking one of these things at random, like you would normally do, motivated by your subjective experience in analyzing data. So that was one thing that's ongoing. And there's a website that we've recently launched with the URL there on the bottom right called Compension. And this is a way that you can drag your own time series data onto this website. It will compute some of its properties, different properties from different parts of science, and then use those properties that we compute of your data to find similar data. And sometimes you'll drag on data from a real world system and it will pop up some similar data from another part of science or a mathematical area where it can kind of suggest mechanisms and connections between the data that you measure and other data being measured from other parts of science. And so this is an open website that lets you participate in sharing your data, and it gives you an incentive for sharing your data because it tells you something interesting about how your data relates to data from other parts of science. And a visualization I've shown there puts all these data in the same space, and you can see that you've got bits of audio clustering together, music and animal sounds, and then you've got time series from medicine and the share market in another part of the space. And when you look at the time series in the right panels there, A, B, C, and D, A, B, and C, you can see each little area has its own characteristic types of patterns. And so we're kind of meaningfully structuring a really interdisciplinary set of both data and methods. And this work is ongoing. There's lots to do. In particular, using it to do useful science. And so we've used this work to answer a lot of specific scientific questions, because we now have access to this big library of thousands of different time series analysis methods, and we can use those thousands of methods to automatically find structure in different types of data sets. So on the top left there, we looked in the mouse brain and we analyzed the dynamics of each brain area in terms of these 7,000 different metrics, and we use that to find a new relationship between the patterns in the dynamics of neural activity and the place in which that brain area is structured in the brain network. So we found that brain areas with lots of connections coming into them from other brain areas these are axonal projections that Pulin mentioned earlier, actually have slower oscillations. And there are some predictions you can make connecting to theories and models for brain dynamics. In particular, areas that are closer to a critical point, you might expect to have slower dynamics because of critical slowing down and other physical theories like that. We're working now to find patterns in brain activity that might be linked to conscious states from neural data. Working with people in clinics to monitor anesthetics, for example. And so we're looking at all the different patterns you can measure from the brain, and also the patterns of communication between different pairs of brain areas, and how we can quantify from all of that data a good measure of conscious state. We're also doing work to find what's different about the brain in different psychiatric disorders by quantifying different properties of brain activity. That's on the right there. Down the bottom, we've done some work looking at ecosystems. So you can measure this guy here, Sarab, we used to climb up into trees in the rainforest, put these little audio recorders, and the audio data would be streamed out for him to collect in real time. And he did that around the world in different areas, and he found the different characteristics of the audio that would tell you how healthy an ecosystem is. So we've been using this kind of time series analysis to find patterns in the audio data from different ecosystems. And then there's another little collaboration we've had within Sydney to try and find patterns in different light curves from stars to distinguish the different types of stars from these huge catalogs of data that are coming from NASA. You want to quickly be able to find new types of stars. How do you find those patterns like a needle in the haystack of all this data? And so we're using our algorithms to automatically find useful patterns in these big databases. So that's one part of what we do. And then the second part is trying to find patterns specifically in the brain using methods from stats and physics. And we want to tie those patterns back to understand something about how the brain is organized and what kinds of physical mechanisms are underlying that brain function, just as Pulin was nicely describing earlier. So one example of recent work we have here is looking at the patterns of gene expression across the brain in the mouse through development. So what we have here is all through the embryonic stages, 11.5, 13.5, 15.5. These are the days through embryonic development. And then after birth, P4, P14, and P28, you can see the mouse brain there changing shape and size. And typically, people find it very hard to analyze the data because the brain's changing shape, it's changing size, it's stretching in one bit, it's another. And so how do you track a brain area across all these different changes in morphology? And so one of the pieces of data they have of the brain at each of these time points is 2,000 genes. And at every point in the brain, they've measured how highly they're expressed. And so a visualization of the data is there in A. And you can see each column is one of these genes. And it shows how highly expressed that gene is in each voxel, each little point, a small volume of the brain, which are shown as rows of the matrix. And you can see, again, lots of different patterns there. When you look at the main gradient, it's shown there in B. You can see these interesting spatial patterns of the gene expression across the mouse brain there. And so instead of actually defining brain areas, as neuroscientists tend to do, we took a more continuum approach of looking at how these patterns decay with distance, shown there at the bottom. And just like a lot of properties in the brain, we found an exponential decay. So this is seen with the probability of two brain areas connecting or two neurons connecting. It tends to drop exponentially with how far they are away from each other in the brain. And when we came up with a method to quantify how similar the gene expression patterns are across two areas, we also found a similar exponential decay in the gene expression similarity with separation distance. And as the brain grows, we show that there's a power law relationship. Well, we hypothesize there's a power law relationship that we could use to predict the same thing in human. We have another project where we hope to build a little nanoscale device that can navigate the brain. So this is work with DNA origami being done over in chemistry with Shelley Wickham. And we're using these new data sets where we have really fine scale information about each little part of the brain across the whole brain. And we can find patterns that might help a nanobot navigate across the brain to get to a particular area. And so if we have a nanobot that can follow certain rules, we can have a kind of Google Maps of the brain. And perhaps if we develop new drugs that can be targeted to a specific brain area, we can get rid of a lot of the problems with current drug treatments in terms of just spreading out everywhere in the brain. We could give it to this little nanobot to deliver it exactly where we want it to go in the brain. So Eloise has been doing really well in driving that this year. And if I have a little bit of time, maybe I'm running out, we have another project where we're trying to model the dynamics. So like I've said, there's been a real expansion in the amount and resolution of data that we have about the brain. You can see there an example of just a single slice of inhibitory and excitatory cells across a slice of the brain, and we have that data across the whole brain. So we can really zoom right in to the smallest parts of the brain now and learn a lot about the structure of neural circuits all across the brain. And so people have measured all this data, but they don't really understand what to do with it or how to make sense of it. And so there's a big need for physicists to come in, take all this open data and make something meaningful out of it. I think that's where we need students like some of you to come in and leverage what a lot of global initiatives have put hundreds of millions of dollars into measuring this data. And now it's up to us to actually find patterns in the data and make something physically meaningful, develop some new theory, and try and interpret what the patterns are in those data. So what a really talented honors student, Poc, and a postdoc now, Eli, are helping to do is to take these brain maps, use them to constrain some dynamic equations, couple them together. So we're using all this new physiological knowledge of the brain to actually develop new models that can help predict the dynamics in the brain. And once we have a model of brain dynamics, then we're open to lots of new exciting things, from developing new machine learning algorithms to actually understanding the mechanisms of disorders and fingerprinting individuals based on their brain dynamics. So here's some examples of some of the papers I've mentioned. You can go and try Comp Engine, drag some data, have a play. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and over to Sveta.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you, Arshil, for organizing. And I do apologize, I again went widescreen. I don't know what is happening. It switches from time to time. So I suppose you'll have to look at me this way. Okay, so I am Svetlana Postnova. And my area of research, yes, I'm sharing the screen. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my area of research is chronophysics. What chronophysics is a fairly new field that bridges across physics and the biology of circadian rhythms. Chrono in chronophysics stands for, well, you know, chronos is time in Latin, and it's coming here from chronobiology, which is an area of biology concerned with circadian rhythms and actually any biological oscillations in general. And because I don't want to assume that everybody here knows what the circadian rhythms are, I first will give you a brief introduction into circadian rhythms, and then I will talk briefly about some of the projects that we have in the area. Okay, so first of all, what are the circadian rhythms and circadian clocks? The circadian rhythms are oscillations with approximately 24-hour period that are seen in nearly all biological processes and all living organisms. In humans, we see this in 24-hour periodicity of, for example, sleep-wake cycles, hormone rhythms, immunity rhythms, metabolism, and alertness. Pretty much every biological process that you can name, it will have circadian rhythm. And these rhythms are controlled by the circadian clocks, which are present in every single cell in the human body. But the master clock that synchronizes all the other clocks in the periphery is located in the brain. These clocks generate self-sustained oscillations, but they are entrained to this exactly 24-hour rhythm by the environmental time cues, with the light-dark cycle being the most important time cue, but also meal times and exercise are important time cues. So why are we interested in the circadian rhythms? The circadian clocks control the time of all the biological processes to ensure coherent work of the complex interconnected systems in the body. Desynchronization or misalignment of these fine-tuned oscillating systems leads to disturbance of circadian rhythms, such as, for example, you all experience during jet lag. As you know, during jet lag, you normally can't sleep during night, you're fatigued, so there are some digestive problems, but this usually go away after a couple of days. However, long-term misalignment, such as, for example, seen in shift workers or in people with chronically just bad lifestyle choices, they would have chronic misalignment, and this leads to increased risk of disease, which includes cancer, diabetes, and metabolic disorders. And as you can see in the figure here on the left, circadian desynchrony pretty much affects every organ in human body. And what we are also learning in recent years is that due to artificial lighting, human set time zones, and fixed work hours, circadian misalignment is even more widespread than we thought. In the figure here on the right, you see a map of the United States with its 4 time zones, and that's, I mean, human set time zones, separated by the gray lines. But of course, the geographical time zones are not discrete, and the sunset and sunrise times change within each time zone. And the color coding in the figure shows the sunset time. So you can see the closer you get to the western border of the time zone, the darker is the color, which means later sunset time. And in the eastern border, you have earlier sunset time. And what researchers found is that this is also, well, this is associated with fairly minor circadian misalignment, but it's a chronic one, right? So it's like day after day after day, maybe all your life, you're exposed to this circadian misalignment. And what was found is that, first of all, people living closer to the western border sleep less on average than those living closer to the eastern border of the time zone by about 20 minutes, but given that goes for lifetime, that's quite significant. And there are high incidence of cancer and metabolic diseases closer to the western border of the time zone. So we all may be exposed to some degree of circadian misalignment, be it temporary with jet lag or chronic, depending on where we live. So it's quite important to study circadian rhythms and understand how we can keep them synchronized for optimal health. So now, why do we study this in physics? And as you probably have already guessed, the circadian clocks are oscillators. And to be more specific, they constitute a system of coupled oscillators with multiple, usually periodic external driving forces, with the light-dark cycle being one of those. So physics allows us to model and study this complex biological system quantitatively and gain insights that would not be possible with, let's say, neuroscience or chronobiology alone. And speaking of oscillators, a 2017 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine was awarded to Hall, Rosbach, and Young for their discovery of specific molecular mechanisms of the circadian oscillators, showing how these 24-hour rhythms are generated in every single cell and what is the mechanics of those oscillators. And these have been modeled by physicists again in detail. So how our group operates, we study all things related to circadian rhythms. At the moment, we mostly focus on circadian rhythms of sleep and alertness. And we use quantitative, physically based modeling, and now also starting to look at data science. And we look at different levels of the system. We study brain mechanisms of the circadian rhythms and how they are manifested at the level of behavior and health. And then we also translate our findings into real-world applications with our industry partners. And of course, as you can imagine, this is very cross-disciplinary work, and we need a lot of collaborations with experimentalists and clinicians. And we work with excellent groups within the University of Sydney with the Woolcock and the Charles Perkins Center, and also with Monash University, and outside of Australia with Harvard and Liège University, and also special collaboration with QIMR on modeling of spatial brain dynamics. Okay, so in the remaining time, I will briefly introduce two examples of research topics that we are working on. And the first one is concerned with circadian photobiology. And what we study here is how light affects circadian rhythms. We do know that light enters the brain through the eye, and its effects on the circadian clocks depend on the timing, history, intensity, and spectrum of the light. And interestingly, until probably about late 90s, it was believed that light acts on the circadian clock through the vision system in the eye, so the well-known rods and cones. And so it was very surprising when researchers found that some blind people can still entrain to the light-dark cycle without any problem. So those people would be missing rods and cones, they cannot see, but they still sense light and adjust to it. And only recently it was shown that a new type of opsin called melanopsin, which is not involved in vision and is most sensitive to short wavelengths of light, so in the blue area of visible light, is responsible for the light input to the circadian system. And we have recently published a model of the system that explains a broad range of experimental observations with different light sources and bringing all the experiments together. So as I mentioned with circadian misalignment, exposure to light at incorrect times can lead to the desynchrony. And this happens because light at different times of day has different effects on our circadian oscillators. So you can see here, this is the circadian phase response curve to light. And what it shows us is that if you're exposed to bright light late in the evening, then your period of circadian oscillation will lengthen, or circadian phase will delay. Or if you're exposed to light early in the morning, it will the period will shorten. And while it can cause problems, it can also be used to manipulate the circadian clocks. And that's what we're trying to do when we design interventions to minimize circadian misalignment. So, for example, in terms of real-world applications, we are designing light interventions to minimize circadian misalignment due to jet lag. In collaboration with Qantas and the Charles Perkins Center, we've incorporated some of these interventions on board of the Perth-London flight, and also tested some of them in 2019 on the direct London to Sydney and New York to Sydney flights. So obviously this data collection is on hold right now, but the study is pretty much still going on. So other applications which we are just starting to work on also include architectural 3D lighting design for alertness and health. And what this means is that you can design your lighting systems in your rooms, offices, hospitals, so like wherever you need them to be, such that they facilitate alertness and circadian alignment, circadian health. So it's a new exciting area in which a lot of companies looking at smart lighting are interested in. And the second topic area that we're working on is inter-individual variability. Well, obviously, every person is different. The phase of circadian oscillators varies between people, which is important for things like design of personalized interventions for jet lag and shift work, and for optimization of timing of medications to induce the strongest effect. However, measuring circadian phase with existing methodologies is very expensive and time-consuming. So one of the questions we aim to answer in this area of research is how to predict or estimate circadian phase from easily obtainable wearable data. And how we do this, we work with large data sets and machine learning and biophysical modeling to try to find a way to predict circadian phase in individuals. Another problem we are working on in this inter-individual variability area is why some people are more vulnerable to sleep loss than others. What experiments show is that if you take a group of people exposed to identical conditions for, say, a week, and then you sleep deprive them for 40 hours, then some people will experience significant increase in lapses of attention, as shown in the figure here in red, while other people will just remain almost at the same level of performance as they were not sleep deprived. And this is a very persistent trend. If you repeat this experiment weeks later, the same people will show the same trend. So inability to predict who is vulnerable to sleep loss is critical in occupational settings with shift work, for example, or in military, in order to avoid accidents and injuries. And our hypothesis is that the circadian regulation of alertness may be responsible for these differences, and we are investigating this again using a large data set. It's actually probably the biggest in the world from our collaborators in Belgium, who collected lots of different biomarkers during sleep deprivation and biophysical modeling together to find what are the mechanisms and how can we predict the differences. And for the real world applications in this topic, we are at the moment mostly looking at shift work and scheduling of shift work, for example, in hospitals to improve alertness, and also optimizing sleep for individual shift workers. And of course, there are lots of other areas of applications for this, which we haven't yet looked into. And I think my time is up. So these are some selected papers which you can have a look at, and feel free to contact me if you want to learn more. And thank you for your attention. I think it's time for questions now.
Yeah, questions.
Yep. I haven't seen anything in the chat. So I guess you can put your hand up or just unmute yourself to talk, or you can write a question in the chat. If there are many people, they can put their hand up to request a question, but I don't think we're in the too many questions problem yet. So let's wait to see if anyone has.
Ben, I have a question actually to start. Unfortunately, I have to run, to another meeting. So I'll take this my opportunity. So, Pulin, and maybe the question to everyone, as you explained beautifully, that the brain is a very complex system, and I guess the mathematical modeling is quite complex as well. Of course you showed this mathematics which is involved in here. Physics wise, I mean, I would naively thought that, the fast and effective the computer like a brain, presumably would use some quantum physics as well. What do you think about this?
Okay. Actually, this is a good question, because I mean, there has been some sort of debates about whether computation is done in the brain, quantum or not. I remember that once a very famous neuroscientist, his name is Chris Koch. Those guys, they point out, there's no room for quantum computation in the brain, because if you think about it, right, if the temperature is very low, right, around like zero, this absolute temperature, which is normally you can make your quantum computers to work, your brain is going to die. So in that sense, maybe, this feasible, noisy or noise robust, this sort of quantum computation can't happen in the brain. But there are indeed some sort of quantum phenomena at the molecular level, that sort of scale. There are many studies on that sort of phenomena. How
would it mean even just the quantum physics? Maybe the tools of quantum physics in mathematics.
Yes, yeah, of course, yes. As I said, maybe use some sort of like physics by extending and also creating some sort of new physics approach to understand how the brain works. For example, for my projects, we've been extending these fractional differential equations for understanding these complex spatial temporal dynamics. And also, for example, some quantum field theories, like Peter Robinson's work. He has been using this quantum field theory for developing neural field theories as well.
Yeah, and Peter's got stuff using Feynman diagrams to estimate effective connectivities and stuff. Yeah, there was a big push very early to find quantum in the brain, because that was meant to be where free will comes from. If it's all deterministic, then, but yeah, the scales that we're interested in, it doesn't play a big role.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. I think there is a question in the chat.
Okay, we'll carry on through the chat then. Thanks, Archil, again, for hosting.
Okay, thanks, Archil.
All right, Stephen. Stephen's like me. He doesn't like saying questions in person. This is why I love Zoom meetings, because introverts can ask their questions by text. All right. Are there examples of complex systems in finance? Can you give some examples? The finance industry is a complex system. Well, yeah, where do you start, right? A lot of people that move from complex systems into finance, and the finance industry tries to poach a lot of people trained in complex systems because these quantitative methods are so useful. And people do it, everything from, say, look at the global trading networks or the global currency networks. You can couple them together into a big global network and try and find patterns, use that to predict the future. People look at a lot of big data sets with time series and try to predict the future of different economic predictors, different share prices, etc. A lot of the finance industry uses a lot of the tools that we use here. And you could therefore ask, why would you pick a job with half the salary when you could be doing complex systems in the finance industry? My supervisor used to say that, because he does complex systems in the university, he used to say, to stay in the uni, you either have to be a genius or crazy, and that he wasn't a genius. But Pulin, do you have any connections to?
Yeah, actually, I can elaborate on this question, because one of my ex-PhD students from Palmer, now he works for bank. Particularly he has been working on building these sort of like large-scale models to model financial market.
Okay.
And the first time he went there for job interview, people there said, "Oh, you see, you can model even the complex dynamics of the brain. So modeling financial systems could be, too easy for you." And he got that job very quickly.
Yeah, they love the skills from complex systems, right? Because it's being quantitative, it's modeling, it's doing simulation.
Yeah, particularly they know that the brain is the most complex system. And if you can do some models for the brain, of course you can do some models for
Everything else is easy.
Like fluctuations or whatsoever.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, another question.
Josh, why are you guys examining areas across the brain of a constant size where some bodily functions have different sized areas allocated in the brain? Yeah, this is where actually speaking in person would help, because I'm not quite sure areas of the brain of a constant size.
Potentially that's about the cortex, the sensory cortex, the different
Maybe
size of
different
areas
brain areas specialized for different function are allocated different amounts of space. Maybe this is talking about the gradient perspective of the mouse brain. I'm not quite sure, but traditional neuroscience has kind of pre-allocated different areas of the brain and defined really rigid boundaries between different areas and given them different labels. And from my perspective, that's just a convenience for humans, because for us, it's easier to say, oh, I've got 10 different brain areas and they do these 10 things. But the reality of the brain is far more continuous than that discrete cut boundaries, and it's a different bit of brain on this side to this side. Actually, the more we look at high resolution brain data, the more we realize just how continuously varying a lot of the properties are. So it's not really that we're assuming the brain has lots of equally sized areas. It's just that we're zooming and treating the entire high resolution spatial and physical extent of the brain and characterizing that. And we're finding these really smoothly varying gradients that traditional neuroscience parcellations are a relatively poor approximation of that reality. Okay. You're not here, but I assume that I, oh yeah, thanks. Okay. All right, one for Sveta from Kwanze.
Yes, so how does sleeping with the light on affect the circadian rhythm of the brain? Well, the effect is not too strong because not all the light, penetrates the eyelids, but we know that some, percentage of light does get through. So it can mess up your circadian clocks. If a person needs to sleep with lights on, the best choice would be to use, low luminance, probably green or red light, definitely nothing blue, because blue light is very strong for the circadian clocks. Even low intensity can, shift the clocks quite a lot. And the second one is, how does physics of the rhythms change when the open eye is exposed to sunlight while we are awake? Change, I'm not sure, is that from when being asleep? Then the difference would be that we actually get a lot of quite strong light input, especially sunlight is extremely strong compared to artificial light inside. It's thousands of times, sometimes, tens of thousands of times stronger. So this entrains the light, the circadian clocks the best, which is why it's often recommended if you want to, sleep well and have good circadian health, get exposed to light, sunlight, outdoors light early in the morning. So first thing, just get out there, spend some time in the light, and then you should be fine.
Is it both the lux and the fact that there's blue?
Yeah, so it's not the lux. That's what our recent paper was about. The lux was the old way we described how light affects the circadian rhythms. Now it's so-called melanopic irradiance, but the idea is the same, sort of the irradiance of light, how strong the light is. And yeah, so if it's usually stronger if it's centered in the blue.
Okay, any other questions? Feel free to ask questions. Yes, Poke.
Yes, for Svetlana. So this is about your the US diagram with the different blue parts. So you said the darker the blue, the increasing rates of cancer, I think it was. I was just wondering what actually was the increase. Was it?
Yes, so that was the sunset time. So that was the later sunset in the figure. with the color coding. And the result is, because in the same time zone, right, the social time is the same. Everybody goes to work at approximately the same time, right? So I don't know, TV, probably you have use at the same time, although I don't know who watches TV anymore. But anyhow, so people are trying to live at the same social time, but they're exposed to different light cues. And as a result, they sleep less when the sunset time is later. And it does make sense, because later sunset time would sort of shift the sleep onset to later time as well, but you still have to wake up to go to work. So this leads to less sleep and then more disease and probably more other things that people will find.
Yeah, I was just wondering,
future.
like, whether you like quantify the amount of increased disease.
Yes, there are numbers and all these sort of significant studies, but I do not have them on the top of my head right now. So yeah, people compared the incidence rate of disease at the Western zone and at the Eastern side of the time zone, and there are statistically significant differences.
Okay, and I guess I've got a general question as well for like all three. So we know that the brain, so there's like two major types of models right now. There's like the discrete neural mass models, which like, you treat the brain as discrete different bits. And then there's like Peter Robinson's neural field models. The brain's a continuous like sheet. Personally, do you guys like using, treating the brain as a discrete system more or a continuous system more? And what are your thoughts on, I guess?
Yeah, I think this depends on the research questions you're interested in. Let's say if you're interested in like a circuit level computation, that sort of aims, it's better to go with like, because a continuous approximation is continuous physics. You have continuous models, right? And so you can use this sort of like PDEs or these sort of techniques to get some theoretical insights. So, I mean, it depends. I think it depends on research questions you're asking. If you want, I mean, if you are interested in how spikes are relevant for information representation or encoding or whatsoever, I mean, you need to look at spike in your circuit models. But if you are using a whole brain, these sort of dynamics, you may go with like field models or neural mass models or whatsoever.
Yeah, I agree. I think whole brain, I like treating the continuous nature of the cortex. I think it's an approximation to cut it up at that scale. But when you're down at single neurons, you have to go discrete because your objects are actually discrete.
Yeah, it's same for me. Oh, I again switched. Just to give you two examples, if you want to simulate sleep-wake cycles, just how the brain goes, between sleep and wake, then we would use neural mass approach, because then we just focus on the brain areas that are deep in the brain. They are small. We are not interested in the spatial dynamics. But if we were interested, for example, in how toxins are cleared from the brain during sleep due to these slow waves that are traveling across the whole cortex, then I would say that would be more appropriate to take the neural field approach.
But after saying that, actually, I would like to point out, I mean, based on my thinking and also what we've done, so I believe that there could be some sort of universal principle across different levels, level to whole brain. So, I mean, think about like this classical theory, renormalization group theory, right? If your system's working near this critical phase transition, and so your system wouldn't care about details. I mean, so you have this coarse graining across scales, in spatial temporal scales. You have this sort of universal, this sort of like principle, I mean, which can explain a lot of things. Actually, that's my dream. I mean, I wanted to come up with some sort of unified theory for explaining a lot of brain functions. We made some sort of progress along that direction. But I do believe that, I mean, although the brain is very complex, I do believe that, I mean, very surprisingly, finally, we may find some sort of general principles. Those principles could be very simple.
Yeah, that's the dream. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob. All right, there's nothing in the chat. Anyone want to give a last minute unmute or type a little something in the chat? Maybe we give a minute left. Otherwise, we'll bring things to a close, I guess.
Okay, and
can't see anything coming, so. Well, thanks everyone for coming.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thanks for coming. And if you have further questions, feel free to contact us.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm sure you can find our emails. And
thank you, everyone.
No worries. Thanks, Spencer.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Asim.
Have a good day.
Okay, bye-bye.
See you, everyone.
Thank you, Tia.
Oh, Maro, you are here.